Hey boys and girls, we're going to pick up where we left off last time in our chapter book called The Twits by Roald Dahl. And if you remember from last week, we met Mr. and Mrs. Twit, who are two older people who are absolutely terrible to each other. So in the last chapter that we read, Mr. Twit had played this terrible joke on Mrs. Twit, making her believe that she had something, a terrible disease called the shrinks. And his cure for her was to stretch her. So he decided to tie her feet to a metal ring and tie lots of balloons to her arms that would cause her to float up. But since her feet were attached to the metal ring, her body wouldn't actually go anywhere. It would just stretch her. Well, she had given him this great idea, making sure that her legs were secure, her feet were secure. He thought, oh, I could just cut her loose and she would go ballooning up and I wouldn't ever have to see her again. Well, Mrs. Twit realized what was happening and she started with her teeth cutting the strings to the balloons. And so then as the balloons flew away and left her body, then she wasn't rising as much anymore and she eventually came back down to the ground. So Mr. Twit, we read, gets a horrible shock when he realizes that Mrs. Twit really outsmarted him. Now, the next chapter is going to go into kind of what their home life is like. So we're going to read about how they live and some pets that they have. And the title of this chapter is The House, the Tree, and the Monkey Cage. We can't go on forever watching these two disgusting people do disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. So here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and their garden. Some house, huh? It really looks like a prison and not a window anywhere. You see the house with no windows. We see a garden, looks like a cage of some sort and a big tree. Now remember the big tree because that's going to come back up. Who wants windows, Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. Who wants every Tom, Dick, and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing? It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out of, not for looking into. And what did you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. Now, she was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles, she used to say, to keep out those nosy little children. Near the house, you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. To one side, there is a big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree, you can see the monkey cage, and there were 4 monkeys in it. They belonged to Mr. Twit, but you'll hear more about them later. Once a week on Wednesdays, the Twits have bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit catches the birds and Mrs. Twit cooks them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before Bird Pie Day, he would put the ladder up against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and a paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hug-Tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of the branches and then he would go away. And as the sun went down, birds would fly in from all over to roost for the night in the big dead tree. They didn't know, poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible Hug-Tight. The moment they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was Bird Pie Day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were. Song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went into the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Now on one Tuesday evening after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hug-Tight, 4 little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. Now they didn't care about the thistles and the stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to look at. So after a while, they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden, and they found the ladder leaning against the big dead tree. They decided to climb it just for fun. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But the next morning when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found 4 miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as could be by the seat of their pants to the branches. There were no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. And Mr. Twit was furious. "As there are no birds for my pie tonight," he shouted, "then it'll have to be boys instead." He started to climb the ladder. "Boy pie might be better than bird pie," he went on, grinning horribly. "More meat and not so many tiny little bones." The boys were terrified. "He's going to boil us," cried one of them, alive. "He'll stew us alive," wailed the second one. "He'll cook us with carrots," cried the third. Here we have a picture of the boys up in the tree. They're looking pretty terrified as Mr. Twit starts to climb the ladder. But the fourth little boy, who had more smarts than the other, he whispered, "Listen, I've just had an idea. We're only stuck by the seat of our pants. So quick, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground." Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to make a grab for the nearest boy when all of a sudden they suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home with their bottoms winking at the sun. So the boys outsmarted Mr. Twit, didn't they? Now, when we come back and read the next chapter, we're going to meet the monkeys that those boys were looking at when they decided to climb the big dead tree. So I will see you later. Bye-bye.